be with us because he's also, along with Len, truly one of the gems of Vanderbilt. I had the honor this past Sunday, the difficult honor of attending the funeral of Alfred Avery. And I knew Alfred and his family through my time in New Jersey because his daughter was the president of my synagogue and so on. But I also knew Alfred as a giant in the field of medieval Jewish and Islamic philosophy. And it is primarily through that connection that I always perceived him as a giant. But at the funeral where his four kids and many other people spoke, I got to see a different side of him, not Professor Avery, but Avi, or to them, the kids, the father who, in the middle of the night when he was working, would nonetheless have a cup of tea with his daughter Rebecca, whom he called Princess, something I never knew. I got to see the human side, and that was very special. And whenever I learn with the copy of the Mishnah Torah that he gave me, his own copy, or the Rambam's medical works that I'm using for a project now, certainly think of him. And so we come to see many of our scholars as scholars, but also they're ultimately people. And the Rambam was no different, right? A philosopher, but also a jurist, medical practitioner, medical theorist, but also ultimately someone who sat in shul with other people in his community. So that personal piece is very important. When it comes to introducing Professor Menachem Kellner, Professor Kellner said, "Oh, I just refer to me as Len's friend. That's enough." That's the human piece that I want to bring. But Professor Menachem Kellner is Professor Goodman's friend, but he is also much more. He's one of the foremost contemporary interpreters of Maimonides and a leading voice in the study of medieval Jewish philosophy. After earning his doctorate at Washington University, taught for decades at the University of Haifa, where he served as the Sir Isaac and Lady Edith Wolfson Chair of Jewish religious thought, and later served as founding chair and on the Department of Jewish Thought at Shalem College in Jerusalem. Another thing about Professor Kellner, in addition to more than a dozen books and dozens of articles, he has laid the groundwork for the next generation of the field. You see in our note for today that his latest book is We Are Not Alone, a Maimonidean Theology of the Other. But in truth, that's not his latest book. His latest book was a book written with his student, our colleague, David Gillis. And so part of what we do is in our scholarship, but also that mentoring is a key piece. So I just want to recognize the importance of Professor Kellner's novel contributions, both in his scholarship and in laying the groundwork for the next generation. Professor Kellner's scholarship is marked by textual precision, historical sensitivity, and a principled commitment to philosophical rationalism, just like the Rambam himself. And by way of closing and introducing his own piece, I very much appreciate the fact that he wishes to explore areas in which Len and I are wrong. If there's one thing I can say about our translation and the reception, it is that it has generated excitement, a renewed vibrancy, and controversy about the guide and its interpretation. And so it's great to see that someone will today challenge some of our own readings of Maimonides' text. Enough of me. Professor Kellner, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Perhaps not correct to correct a very generous introduction that we just heard, but when I found out that Professor Wasserstein couldn't be here, I said, all I have to do is tell people I'm a longtime friend and admirer. That Professor even left out of Len Goodman. So I think that's important to make that point. I also want to start by thanking Shafiq for his kind comments about an old paper of mine, which I didn't realize anybody ever read, but it was much appreciated. as was your own lecture, which I found fascinating and opening up avenues of understanding Rambam, the Maimonides that I never thought of before. And therefore, I want to thank you for that. Um, I wanted to make one other comment about the translation. When the late Michael Schwartz sent me his new Hebrew translation of the Guide of the Perplexed about a dozen years ago, I wrote to him and said, "Say Yom Chag Yisrael. This is a holiday for the Jewish people." And I think that the Goodman and Lieberman translation of the Guide to the Perplexed is also a holiday for the Jewish people. It opens up a wholly new era in the study of Maimonides, and I think all of us who are interested in Maimonides are deeply grateful to the two of them for their amazing work. Now, I originally wanted to call this paper Pauline Keel and the Question of Sacrifices in the Messianic Era, but a number of people convinced me that that would make no sense to anybody, so I'll tell you what it meant. There is a well-known controversy or debate within the Rambam. Pardon me, I'm just going to call him Rambam, okay? After 45 years of teaching at Israeli universities, the word Maimonides does not spring easily from my lips. In any event, there is a well-known apparent contradiction in Rambam's writing between his view at the end of the Mishnah Torah, the legal work, and his view in the Guide of the Perplexed, especially part 3, chapter 32. And that is over the question, did he expect that there would be sacrifices in the Messianic era? Now, Pauline Keel was a very famous film critic at the New Yorker back in the 1970s. And she is famous for having said, after Richard Nixon was elected president of the United States in 1972, she said to her friends, "How is that possible? Nobody I knew voted for him." You're supposed to be amused by that. In any event, for many years, everybody I know, including myself, were convinced that Rambam's view in the Guide about the nature of sacrifices made it impossible for him to think that there could be sacrifices in the Messianic era. So that's the question I want to address tonight. I want to make a few introductory comments about how I plan to do it. First of all, I'm aware of the fact that I am the only thing standing between you and the morning break. So as a person who loves coffee in the morning, even though now it's evening here in Israel, I will try to keep myself no more than 30 minutes so that you guys can get to the break that has been promised to you. I also want to make a couple of other introductory comments that I don't think there are two. I don't think that Rambam and Maimonides barely knew each other. I think they knew each other very well, and there's only one such person. Unlike the famous joke that they first heard from Sholem Rosenberg, he told me he heard it from Petrovsky of the Hebrew College, that Maimonides is called Maimonides because it's Maimonides, your Maimonides, his Maimonides, and her Maimonides. I think there's only one. And I'll try and show an expression of that in this morning's talk. One other thing, this is a very important comment because I have to live with her. My wife always reminds me before I go to talk about anything about the Rambam, remember he was also a rabbi. In addition to all of his other important jobs, he was very much an active rabbi in every sense of the term, and we have to bear that in mind when we read what he wrote in every context that he wrote in. Now, what I'm going to do is, thanks to the intervention of Eli and Micah, I have sent out a bunch of texts, which those of you in Vanderbilt should have. I apologize to those of you who are not in Vanderbilt. I wasn't smart enough to think that you deserve them also, but I'll read them to you. I have 15 texts, and I will read them and then discuss them. And by way of making my point that Lieberman and Goodman are wrong about one footnote. Okay. I want to now get to that point. At the end of his part of his revolutionary discussion of why sacrifices were commanded in the Bible, Rambam basically says that the Torah was given in order to teach what he called God's prime intent. that the Israelites come to know God and give up pagan worship. The sacrificial cult was an accommodation on God's part to the pagan character of the Israelites leaving Egypt. It was certainly not God's prime intent. On that was in page 437 in the Goodman-Lieberman translation. On that, we find footnote 350. I'm just going to read the last few sentences of the footnote. It's text number 1 in your handout. The text reads as follows: reserving the core principle of symbolically serving the divine, the Torah accepts sacrifices as a mode of worship, but rejects its pagan modalities. Every time I see that line, I'm reminded of the fact that students entering Shalem College are given the Iliad to read in the summer before they start their college. Anybody who remembers the Iliad knows that the drop of a hat, it would bring dozens of animals to sacrifice. Those are the kinds of pagan modalities Rambam is talking about here. Oh, I don't think he read the Iliad. Okay, delicately steering a course between accommodation and rejection. The Torah accommodates familiar ritual practices, but sharply contrasts its new modalities with their pagan counterparts as if to rebut them. Trusting the very power of tradition that made the old paganism robust, Maimonides treats the temple cult with seriousness and respect, not least in the Mishnah Torah. The traditional liturgy longs for its restoration. But Maimonides, who did not use italics, who shares such hopes, does not rule out changes once the temple is restored in Messianic days. And that I see as a hint to the claim by Lieberman and Goodman, all of them together, that there is reason to think that Rambam's view of the Messianic era did not include the resurrection, so to speak, of the sacrificial cult. Now, that's the point I want to make in this discussion today. I hope I can convince you in the time allotted to me. But if I can't convince you, just accept this as a reading of the Rambam. Now, after a long introduction about the necessity of divine accommodation as an explanation for why sacrifices were commanded, Rambam returns to his point and ours and says, now this is text number 2. This is from the translation on page 439. Worship of this sacrificial sort was ancillary. Prayer and supplication and the like came close to the prime intent and are needed to achieve it. So God sharply distinguishes the one primary from the secondary. Even when offered in his name, sacrifices were not to be offered by us as they once were, anywhere and at any time. Temples may not be built just anywhere, nor may just anyone offer sacrifice. God forbade all this. He established in just one house, no sacrifice may be offered elsewhere, and only those of specified descent may serve as priests. All this was to limit worship of this sort. Preserving only as much of it as God's wisdom determined must not be wholly abandoned. This is a truly revolutionary conception of Torah. The Torah given at Sinai was not originally meant to be given. Had the Israelites coming out of Egypt been all sophisticated philosophers, the Torah would have looked differently. The Torah as given is a divine accommodation to human weakness, ignorance, and willfulness. God would have, so to speak, preferred to have given another Torah, which was the pure Torah of Abraham, or at the very least, the Torah of Mara, Exodus 15, 25 to 26, which appealed to the intellectual and social needs of human beings in their societies. Rambam in part 3, chapter 32 says that the story he's telling is that the Jews came out of Egypt. They reached this place where the water was very bitter, and God told Moses to throw a particular tree into the water and sweeten the water. And at that point, according to the rabbinic interpretation of the verses, God insisted that the Jewish people start observing the Sabbath and adopt what we would call today correct interpersonal relations. Now, that revolutionary conception of Torah obviously did not go down well with most people who read it. In fact, Rambam says that himself on page 440. This is text number 3. These words trouble everyone I have seen or heard discuss them. Mibucha, consternation, as Len just said a minute ago. God's prime intent of the Torah is that you know me, God, and serve no other. And he cites the verse. The laws constituting instituting sacrifice and visitation of the temple served only to cement our central principle. It is only to that end that I transpose these practices to my name, to erase all traces of paganism and establish my unity, etc. Okay. These three texts together teach something quite remarkable. In effect, let us say that the Judaism did not have sacrifices. Well, if there were no sacrifices, there would be no need for special place in which to bring them. There would be no tabernacle in the wilderness or temple in Jerusalem. If there were no sacrifices, there would be no need for a priestly class. Speaking as a Levite, I find that a little bit troubling because and there would be no need for the tithes that support the priests and the Levites. And there'd be no need for the laws of ritual purity and impurity, which Rambam tells us exist only in order to achieve awe of the temple. And there'd be no need for the pilgrim festivals. It turns out that several score of the Torah's traditionally numbered 613 commandments would not have been given had the Israelites living in Egypt been able to fulfill the Torah as God originally intended it to be fulfilled. On this view, Judaism as we have it appeared to be a debased, imperfect expression of God's own vision, as it were, of his Torah. Furthermore, even statutory prayer turns out to be an example of divine accommodation for perfect humanity. Perfect worship would be meditation alone, no act. Rambam tries to explain, using prayer as an example, that in the same way that if the Jews had been told on leaving Egypt that they worship God without sacrifice, they would not understand what that meant. They wouldn't be able to do it. In the same way, he says, if a prophet were to come today and tell us that God doesn't want us to engage in worship, ritual prayer, prostration, the various holidays that are in the Torah, but rather wants us to worship only through intellectual meditation, no one would be able to handle that. So we see here also that even prayer, the central focus of the life of most Jews today, is an accommodation to the ignorance of the and unsophistication of the Jews coming out of Egypt. Now, I think these are the kinds of texts which lead people to think that Maimonides could not possibly have meant that in the days of the Messiah, and I'll get to that in a few minutes, he could have probably meant the reintroduction of the sacrificial cult. I also think there's another issue here. I can speak only in terms of myself, that I find the whole notion of sacrifice unsophisticated, primitive. On the one hand, I feel that strongly. On the other hand, I'm a meat eater, so obviously can survive with slaughterhouses and everything that goes along with them. But I think many of us who read Rambam assume that he is, like us, someone who found the notion of animal sacrifice apparently appropriate only for an earlier stage of human development. However, that doesn't seem to be his view in the Mishneh Torah. Let's look at text 4. Now, text 4 is the opening of Rambam's discussion of the Messianic era. Now, let me remind you that the Mishneh Torah is legal work written in his 40s, I think, and meant to be a codex of law for all of the Jewish people for around the world. It was divided into 14 volumes, and each volume was divided into sections. The 14th volume is divided into a number of sections. The last section is called Laws of Kings and Their Wars. And this last section ends the entire Mishneh Torah. And the last section about laws of kings and their wars ends with 2 chapters devoted to the special king, namely the Messiah. There's a lot to be said about this, but we're not going to go into that today. So what does he say at the opening of these 2 chapters? Well, Laws of Kings, chapter 11, paragraph 1. King Messiah will arise and restore the kingdom of David to its former state and original sovereignty. He will rebuild the sanctuary and gather the dispersed of Israel. All the ancient laws will be reinstituted in his days. Sacrifices will again be offered. The sabbatical and jubilee years will again be observed in accordance with the commandments set forth in the Torah. Now, here we have Rambam opening his discussion of the Messianic era in the Mishnah Torah. And the first thing he says is the laws will be reinstituted, and which is the first example he brings, namely sacrifices. The person who says this apparently thought there would be sacrifices in the Messianic era. And we also add to this fact that of the 14 volumes of the Mishnah Torah, at least 4 directly deal with the sacrificial cult. Now, however, that would seem to be an indication that Rambam did not really think that there would be he thought there would be sacrifices in the Messianic era. And now I want to bring a number of texts which support Budman and Lieberman's position that there would not be sacrifices. Now we're going to look at an important chapter in that same text, Laws of Kings. The sages and prophets did not long for the days of the Messiah so that they might exercise dominion over the world, or rule over the nations, or be exalted by the peoples, and not in order to lead and bring and rejoice, but so that they be free to devote themselves to the Torah and its wisdom. That's an important point. We're not going to go into that. With no one to oppress or disturb them, and thus be worthy of life in the world to come, as we explained in laws concerning repentance. Then at that point, there will be neither famine, nor war, neither jealousy, nor strife. Good things will be abundant, and delicacies as common as the dust. The one preoccupation of the whole world will be only to know the Lord. Hence, they, I hope that the word they is shaded in yellow in your text, will be very wise, knowing things now unknown, and will apprehend knowledge of their Creator to the utmost capacity of the human mind, as is written, for the land shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. I have to make an introductory comment in a parenthesis. It is said, I was never able to find out if this is actually true or not, that when the plays of William Shakespeare were first translated into Yiddish, the translator, I don't know Yiddish well enough to say the whole thing, the translator wrote that these are the plays of William Shakespeare, verteidigt und verbessert, translated and improved. You're supposed to smile at that. Now, Rambam has been subjected to that over and over again, especially in the Mishnah Torah. The texts that many of you have sitting on your shelves have been subjected to verteidigt und verbessert, translated and improved. Now, here in this paragraph, it's the closing paragraph of the whole Mishnah Torah. We have an example of that. It says, hence they will be very wise. In almost all the editions you have on your shelves, it says, hence Israel will be very wise. Now, what we have here is, I want to make just 2 brief points about this. First of all, this text is extremely utopian, and secondly, extremely universalist. But if you read it in the versions that you have in your home, the universalist aspect is rendered less obvious. Okay, so here we have this notion that the end of days, when the Messiah comes, the world will be in a totally different place, and it will truly be a utopia. Now, there are other texts in which Rambam supports the idea that Mishnah Torah agrees with the guide of the perplexed, but the issue of sacrifices. But I see I'm going to go over time. I'm skipping number 6. You will see there, the 4th line from the bottom of the first 2 words, even upon, in the standard text, it says, Rishvil, for the sacrificial cult. Well, you can read that at home, and Lem will test you afterwards. We'll skip that for right now. Now I want to get to one more text from Laws of Kings, which I think is very important for our purposes. This is a text which I'm going to cite again in a few minutes, number 10. Number 7, Mishnah Torah, Laws of Kings, 12:1. Let it not enter your mind that in the days of the Messiah, any aspect of the regular order of nature will be abolished, or some innovation will be introduced into the world of nature. Rather, the world follows its accustomed course. Olam kaminago noeg. The verse in Isaiah, the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard lie down with the kid, is an allegory and metaphor. Of course, there's not a problem. There's no problem with the wolf dwelling with the lamb as long as you have a big supply of lambs. So you don't have to see this as some kind of miraculous thing. It can be perfectly natural. The meaning is that Israel will dwell in security with those who were the wicked nations of the earth, which are allegorically represented as wolves and leopards. As it says, the wolf of the desert ravages it. A leopard lies wait by their towns. The nations, those nations, will all adopt the true religion, Dat HaEmet. In consequence, they will neither rob nor destroy. Rather, they will eat permitted foods in peace and quiet as Israelites. Here, too, we have an example of Vertaichen for Besser, because the printed texts usually say with, not as. As it says, the lion, the lamb, all similar things written about the King Messiah are allegories. And in the days of the Messianic King, everyone will understand which matters are allegories and also the meaning hinted at them. So we have here, again, a very utopian picture of the end of the Messianic era, which leads many people to think Rambam could not possibly have meant in such a wonderful utopia, pardon me, that sacrifices would not be offered. Now, there's an important text here which I want to cite from the guide, which Zev Harvey has taught us in one of his many essays, is in effect a restatement of that last chapter, last paragraph in the Mishnah Torah, which we just read. This is the guide, section 3, chapter 11. In the Goodman-Lieberman translation, pages 353 to 354. Those grave evils that human beings inflict on one another, too, out of ambition, passion, opinions, and beliefs, all reflect privations. Just as a blind man, sightless and unguided, always stumbles, harming himself and others, human sects perpetuate dreadful evils against their fellow humans and themselves, reflecting their ignorance. Had they the insight befitting our human form, as vision befits the eye, all the harm they do to each other and themselves would end. For knowledge of the truth would dissolve hatred and spite and end the crimes of man against man. Thus, the promise, the wolf shall go with the lamb, and the leopard couch with the kid, the cow graze with the bear, the suckling play by the viper's nest. And the reason given why such strife, hatred, and service or power will end, man will truly know God as he truly is. They shall not harm or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And we just saw in the previous text from the Mishnah Torah that that's the promise of the Mishnah Torah. This is what will happen with the same verses from Isaiah and the same idea, a total utopian view of the future. And when you we look at that from our perspective, I think you agree with me, it seems hard to believe that we'll go back to offering sacrifices, which in the first place were only an accommodation to our primitive and ignorant character. Now, it seems to me, I'm closing on the. Do I have more time? I don't think so. Right. So I assume that I'm in charge. So I'm going to move along more quickly.
Okay, but please feel free to, give us your presentation.
I don't want to impose myself too much. All right, I'll just summarize till I get to the point I think is important to me. Text 9 is important to us because here Rambam says about the Messianic era something entirely different from what we just learned. Similarly, with regard to the cities of refuge, but Deuteronomy 19:8-9 states, when God will expand your borders, you must add 3 more cities. This command was never fulfilled. Surely God not given this command in vain. So what we have here is the notion that in the Messianic era, there will still be people who inadvertently kill others and have to run into a city of refuge so as not to be murdered by the relatives of the people they killed. In other words, unlike the picture we just saw of a totally utopian future, Rambam here is talking about a perfectly normal, natural Messianic era in which people inadvertently kill others and have to run away to escape being killed themselves by the relative of the murdered person, the killed person. Okay, so what are we doing here now? Which vision of Rambam is correct? Is it the utopian vision, which makes it hard to believe that the sacrificial cult will be reinstituted, or is it the realistic version that we find right here? What we would call Olam Kamina Go Noeg, a normal world running normally. Now, I want to finally get to my point and argue and try to show you that Rambam agrees with me that asking the question I just asked is the wrong question. Now, many people throughout history have asked that wrong question. Isaac Abravanel and Avadia Sforno both wrote explicitly that God offered the sacrifices because he was forced to do so by the primitive character of the Jewish people. They even used the same Hebrew word, utzrach, was necessitated, was forced. In other words, they're asking the question, well, which vision of the future is the correct one? The one that relates to the primitive character of the Jewish people, or the one that relates to the beautiful vision of a messianic era full of the nation of the Lord's knowledge of the Lord? Now, that I think is the wrong question. And that wrong question leads us to the debate in which Rambam are we talking about? The Rambam of the utopian future, or the Rambam of the realistic future in which there will still be cities of refuge? Now, if I were to have another 2 hours, I would tell you that our colleague Sarah Klein-Braslavi has shown us that in many cases, especially in Guide to the Perplexed Part 1, Chapters 1 to 2, and Guide to the Perplexed Part 2, Chapter 30, that Rambam shows us that he did not think the Torah was teaching history. And I think I'm going to skip 2 examples of that, which are very interesting. Perhaps I'll get to, we'll skip number 12, because it's one thing for a talented colleague like Sarah Klein-Braslavi to argue in great detail, and I think in great convincing detail, that Rambam did not see the opening chapters of the Guide as actual history, or did not see the entire story of Garden of Eden and the snake, etc., as actual history. These are not texts teaching what happened. They're texts that teach things we're supposed to learn from them. Now, even a very famous contemporary rabbi who died 15, 20 years ago, Joseph Kafich, made the same point. And this is text number 12. In this text number 12, Rabbi Kafich writes in his commentary on Maimonides' Laws of the Sabbath, where the Rambam הביא את הטעם המציאותי והתעלם מכל לשון המדרש בהתאם לשיטתו של כל אותו תיאור של אדם וחווה ונחש ברשת ב' ומונחים אלגוריים, כמו שכתב במרנופים חלק ב' פרק ל', ולא חווה האישה הטבעית והיא שגרמה מיתה לאדם. The question is, why are there special commandments given to women, including lighting the Sabbath candles? And the Talmud tries to argue this connected to the sin of Adam and Eve, and Kafich is saying, no, Rambam ignores all that. He's just interested in the halacha of how you're supposed to light candles. But because here we have this member of the high rabbinical court saying that Maimonides' discussion of the Garden of Eden story is an allegory. I think that's the point I'm trying to make here. It's important, an important point. The Torah does not teach history. It teaches us important messages and important lessons, but it's not an historical work. And therefore, when Rambam in part 3, chapter 32, insists that God commanded the sacrifices because of the primitive character of the Jewish people coming out of Egypt, he wasn't teaching history. What he is teaching, we'll get to in a minute. Now, there are a number of important points to be made here, which I'll do very, very quickly, again, to save patience. Our colleague, from whom you'll hear later on today, when I shall hopefully be safely asleep, Kenneth Seeskin, has suggested in a variety of different places that Maimonides' view that the Torah commandments have to be maintained because the Jewish people could backslide after the coming of the Messiah, and the Torah must be preserved for that purpose. And I'll read an interesting text about that. I'm taking this from Maimonides' introduction to the chapter 10, Mishnah Sanhedrin, Perek Chelek, and I bring the text as translated in Isidore Twersky's Maimonides Reader, page 415. But the Messiah will die, and his son and grandson will reign in his stead. The prophet has already predicted his death in the verse, he shall not fail or be crushed till he has set the right to the earth. However, his reign will be a very long one. All human life will be longer than when worries and troubles are removed, men live longer. And there's no reason for surprise that the Messiah's reign will extend for thousands of years. As our sages have put it, when good is gathered together, it cannot be speedily dissipated. All right. So the Messianic era could last for a very long time, but not forever. So what happens afterwards? Well, the Rambam doesn't say, but one could explain, one could understand that he would think that even though the Messianic era was a very successful polity, it would come to an end. And that we would be, using Siskin's writings, we could claim that we need the Torah then, because then the people will have given up or lost the perfections that they had in the Messianic era. And just another example of Parteichen for Bessert, the Twersky translation says our sages, but the actual Arabic says al-Hikmah, it doesn't say al-Chachamim. When Rambam is talking about the rabbinic sages, he always says al-Chachamim. When he says al-Hikmah, he means philosophers. So here too is just another example of how careful you have to be when reading the Rambam's text. Now, there's one point to be made, not my important point. And the other point is in text number 14, which I'm going to skip, because the point of that text is to say that Rambam distinguishes between the history which explains why a commandment was given, distinguished from the obligation to continue it. Rambam did not think that offering an historical explanation for the commandments meant that when history changes, they no longer have to be commanded. He, for example, had to search the record of ancient idolatry in order to understand many of the commandments of the Torah. He did not in any way diminish his commitment to fulfilling those commandments to the letter. So now we have a new question. What's the story? What's Rambam's story of the Messianic era? Was he a pessimist about humanity's future, which is why he would have cities of refuge? Must the vast majority of human beings remain forever mired in intellectually primitive paganism? I don't think so. Such a thought runs counter to an important strain of Maimonidean optimism. I think Rama held that the Messianic era is possible and can and must be brought about through human effort. Rambam is indeed an optimist about the human condition. He was also a realist and recognized the possibility of backsliding. The Messianic era might last for even 1,000 years, but it too could generate back into paganism. There's thus always a need for a Torah aimed at all human beings, not just at philosophers. In the same way, the Eden story teaches values, not history. If we buy into that idea, then the account of the Messianic future, both in the Mishnah Torah and in the Guide of the Perplexed, is not a prediction. It's not an account of what will happen. Rather, I think telling us is it's an account of a future which we should aim for, even if it's not clear that we will ever actually arrive at it. In terms I learned from my teacher, Stephen Schwarzschild, it is regulative, not predictive. Now, I want to make one more point. I think Rambam held that because the coming of the Messiah was something that was done without special effects, without miracles, that is something which could be accomplished. And if it could be accomplished, then we have an obligation to try to accomplish it. And Kant insisted that ought implies can. If I ought to do something, I must be able to do it. Stephen Schwarzschild insisted on a Jewish corollary. If I can achieve some worthwhile goal, then I'm obligated to try to achieve it. Now, what sort of worthwhile goal does Rambam want us to have in mind when we fulfill the commandments? For this, we have our last text, number 15. This is from Book of Commandments, Positive commandment 3, excuse me. The last text I'm going to read you. By this injunction, we are commanded to love God, exalted be He, that is to say, to dwell upon and contemplate His commandments, His injunctions, and His works, so that we may obtain a conception of Him, and conceiving Him, attain absolute joy. This constitutes the love of God and is obligatory. As the Sifri says, since it is said, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God, the question arises, how is one to manifest love for God in this world? Therefore, Scripture says, and these words which I command thee this day shall be upon thy heart. Although this, i.e., the contemplation of God's words, through this you will learn to discern Him whose word called the universe into existence. We have thus made it clear to you that through this act of contemplation you will attain a conception of God and reach that stage of joy in which love of Him will follow of necessity. The sages say that this commandment also includes an obligation to call upon all mankind, all humankind, to serve God and to have faith in God. For just as you praise and extol anybody whom you love and call upon others to love Him, so if you love the Lord to the extent of the conception of His true nature to which you have attained, you will undoubtedly call upon the foolish and ignorant knowledge of the truth which you have already acquired. As the Sifri says, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God. This means that you should make Him beloved of men as Abraham your father did, as it said, of the souls that had gotten in Haran. That is to say, just as Abraham being a lover of the Lord, as Scripture testifies, by the power of his conception of God and of his great love for Him, summon mankind to believe, you too must so love Him as to summon mankind unto Him. Maimonides' messianic teaching is a challenge to us. Do exactly what he says in this in this passage from the Book of Commandments. The discussion here, I hope, has shown that although there is good reason to think that Rambam thought there wouldn't be sacrifices in the Messianic era, there's even better reason to think that he thought there would be. While Goodman and Lieberman's position homes in on Maimonidean hope, I seek a more nuanced combination of Maimonidean hope and realism at the same time. To repeat myself, there is something else that Maimonidean Messianic Universalism and Naturalism teaches us. Hope. This is something I learned from Kenneth Seeskin, who again will be speaking later today. We can hope for and work toward a world in which different nations and cultures can value their own contributions to the human mosaic without diminishing the value of others, without wholly otherizing the other. But we can hope, we need not despair. The human condition is not necessarily tragic. That's the message that Kellner's Rambam is trying to teach. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Kellner, for that optimistic note on the Rambam's view of history, and also the note that the Bible is itself not teaching history, something for those of us who teach history and also teach the Bible, right, we bear in mind. Because of the time, I just want to give the group perhaps the opportunity to ask one brief question, if we have it from the floor, because I do want to give Professor Yaspi, who is also in Israel, the opportunity not to be burning the midnight oil in Israel. Do we have a question from the floor or from other participants via Zoom? I wonder if that's Professor Schatz, please.
Yes, I don't know how short this can be. I'm going to read you a passage, and I'll tell you the author at the end. I think you'll be very surprised. This is actually a defense of the idea that sacrifice should be reinstituted. The author argues as follows: just as the community must ever, must ever remain aware of man's potential for cruelty by recalling the sale of Joseph by brothers, so too must the community of Israel remember that its forefathers were subject to the attractions of paganism. Jews must not succumb to the illusion they have transcended the need for a halacha, for it was the law which weaned men away from paganism, but this weaning is not a necessary process in history. By maintaining the laws of sacrifice, the Jew might be reminded of his human vulnerability to paganism. Thus, ample room exists for legitimizing the halakhic practices whose legislative rationale is no longer operative. In these arguments, he says, attempt to show Maimonides' codification of sacrifice in the Mishnah Torah does not necessarily negate the approach to God which they developed in the garden. You know who the author of that is? It's from 1976. It's a very interesting argument. And it also suggests that it's important for us to be aware of our history, because what's going to happen, in the Messianic age, to get rid of all of this history, and we'll know all the history. The author is David Hartman. I don't think he would have written this. That's why I kept it and said, for those of you who don't know, David Hartman was, how would you describe it, Menachem? Whatever. This is not the kind of thing you would expect from him. But it's an interesting argument. I think the real problem we'll have is if animal sacrifice are instituted, it's going to be. You just can't imagine it empirically. You just can't think of what it's going to be like. But it's interesting. It's part of our history. All this is part of our history.
I just want to make clear. Thank you very much, David. That was very interesting. I agree with you. I don't see how possible animal sacrifices could be reinstituted. But my opinion is of no interest to anybody. Rambam's opinion is of interest to many of us.
It's interesting. Hartman got this idea from Rambam. It was inspired, he says, by Rambam. Interesting.
Like I'm inspired by Rambam. Doesn't mean I'm right.
Wonderful. Listen, I hope that we all continue to be inspired by Rambam, and we sit with the tension that he experienced, as your wife says, always as a rabbi, but also as a thinker. Thank you very much, Professor Kellner, for an outstanding presentation.
Thank you.